There are moments in the life of a warship when the universe itself seems to hold its breath, when the machinery hums not with routine precision but with the uneasy tension of something about to go catastrophically wrong, and for the UNSC Infinity, that moment began as nothing more than a routine slipspace transition, a calculated jump plotted through known coordinates, guided by equations that had carried humanity across the stars for decades, and yet beneath the surface of that calculated certainty something ancient and unseen had already begun to interfere, something not bound by the rules infinity understood, something that existed beyond the predictable logic of human science, and as the ship's engines roared to life and space itself folded inward, the first fracture appeared not on any screen or sensor, but in the very fabric of the transition itself, a ripple that twisted the slipspace corridor into something unstable, something alive, something watching. Inside the vast superstructure of infinity, where thousands of personnel moved through corridors designed for war, exploration, and survival, the subtle shift became a violent reality in an instant as the slipspace tunnel destabilized, its smooth, controlled geometry collapsing into chaotic spirals of energy that surged across the hull like a storm clawing at the edges of existence. And what should have been a brief passage through folded space stretched into an eternity of distortion, where time seemed to stutter and reality bent in impossible ways, and though the ship's systems fought to compensate, recalibrating fields and reinforcing structural integrity, the anomaly only grew stronger, feeding on the very energy that sustained the jump, as if the act of travel itself had awakened something that refused to let infinity pass unchallenged. The crew felt it not just through the alarms and the violent shuddering of the deck beneath their feet, but through a deeper, more primal sense that something had gone terribly wrong, that they were no longer moving through space as they understood it, but had instead crossed into a boundary where the known laws of their universe no longer applied, and in the command center, where decisions were made in fractions of seconds that determined the survival of everyone aboard, the realization began to take shape that this was not a malfunction that could simply be corrected, not a navigational error that could be rerouted, but an event of unknown origin and unknown consequence, something that had seized the infinity mid-transition and was dragging it somewhere beyond the reach of everything humanity had ever mapped. Outside the ship, within the collapsing slipspace corridor, the distortion intensified into something almost luminous, a violent convergence of energies that pulsed with patterns eerily reminiscent of Forerunner architecture, ancient signals embedded within the chaos that seemed to resonate with the infinity's own augmented systems, as though the ship itself was being recognized, identified, and ultimately claimed by forces that predated its existence by millennia, and as that resonance deepened, the boundary between slipspace and real space began to tear apart completely, not in a controlled exit, but in a catastrophic rupture that expelled the infinity from the corridor with explosive force. The transition ended not with precision, but with impact, as the massive vessel was thrown violently into open space, its engines sputtering as the slipspace field collapsed behind it like a dying star, and for a moment, there was only silence, a vast and disorienting stillness that followed the chaos, as if the universe itself needed time to reassert its own structure after what had just occurred, and within that silence, the infinity drifted, its systems struggling to stabilize, its sensors flickering as they attempted to interpret the unfamiliar void that now surrounded them. What appeared on the displays was not merely unexpected, but impossible, because the stars themselves were wrong, their positions unfamiliar, their spectral signatures unaligned with any known chart, constellations that did not exist within the Milky Way stretching across the darkness in patterns that defied every database the infinity possessed. And as the ship's AI worked tirelessly to reconcile the data, to find some correlation, some explanation that would anchor this reality to something known, the conclusion it reached was as simple as it was unthinkable, that the UNSC Infinity was no longer in its home galaxy at all. The realization spread through the ship like a shockwave, carried through reports and confirmations that left no room for doubt, and with it came a weight that no amount of military training could fully suppress, the understanding that they were alone in a way that humanity had never experienced before, cut off not just by distance, but by the sheer impossibility of the journey that had brought them here, and yet even in that isolation, the infinity remained what it had always been, a fortress, A symbol of humanity's resilience, a machine built not just to survive the unknown, but to confront it head-on. And as systems came back online and the ship's full capabilities were restored, the crew began to do what they had been trained to do: to assess, to adapt, to prepare. Long-range sensors pushed outward into the alien expanse, scanning for anything that could provide context, for signals, anomalies, or signs of life. And it did not take long before something answered that search, a faint but unmistakable transmission, structured in a way that was both familiar and foreign, carrying within it the unmistakable patterns of human communication, and yet layered with encryption protocols and signal distortions that suggested a level of technological divergence that could not be easily explained. And as the data was analyzed and decoded, one fact became clear: that humanity was already here, somewhere within this unknown galaxy. That discovery shifted everything, transforming their situation from one of absolute isolation to one of uncertain connection, because if humans had reached this place before them, then there were questions that demanded answers, questions about how, when, and under what circumstances such a journey had been made, and more importantly, what kind of galaxy they had arrived in, and whether those distant signals represented allies, survivors, or something far more complicated. As the Infinity adjusted its trajectory to investigate, moving cautiously through a region of space that seemed quiet on the surface but carried subtle anomalies that hinted at deeper complexities, the weight of their arrival began to settle into something more tangible, a sense that they had not simply been transported to another location, but had crossed into a different chapter of existence entirely, one where the rules would have to be learned from scratch, where every encounter could redefine their understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe far larger than they had ever imagined. And it is here, at the very edge of the unknown, where everything begins to change, because the arrival of the UNSC Infinity is not just an accident of physics or a miscalculation of navigation, but the opening move in a chain of events that will ripple across this entire galaxy, altering the balance of power in ways no one could have predicted. If you want to witness how a single ship can reshape an entire civilization, how humanity's greatest war machine will collide with a galaxy already struggling to survive its own conflicts, then now is the moment to make sure you are part of this journey. So take a second to like the video if you are ready for this level of cinematic storytelling, share it with anyone who loves Halo and Mass Effect crossovers, drop your thoughts in the comments about what you think Infinity's first real battle will look like in Andromeda, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Because this is only the beginning, where every decision, every battle, and every discovery will push this galaxy closer to a future that no one is prepared for. The silence that followed Infinity's violent arrival did not last long, because in a galaxy already fractured by survival, nothing of that scale could remain unnoticed for long. And as the massive supercarrier adjusted its orientation and pushed deeper into the unfamiliar expanse of the Heleus Cluster, the faint human transmission that had first sparked hope began to resolve into something far more complex. Layered signals branching across multiple frequencies, each one carrying fragments of a larger network that spoke not of a unified civilization, but of scattered outposts clinging to existence on the edge of failure. The data streamed across Infinity's systems in dense cascades of code, unfamiliar encryption patterns interwoven with recognizable human structures. And while the AI worked to translate and reconstruct the message, the sheer instability of the signal hinted at a reality far removed from the organized strength of the UNSC, a reality where humanity was no longer expanding with confidence, but surviving through desperation. As the signal clarified, fragments of its origin emerged, references to something called the Initiative, mentions of colonies that had failed before they had truly begun, and scattered identifiers that placed these transmissions light years apart within the same cluster, suggesting a fragile network stretched across hostile territory. The realization settled slowly but heavily across the command deck, because this was not a thriving human presence, not a second wave of expansion that had flourished in parallel with their own, but something far more precarious, a colony effort that had arrived in this galaxy only to be broken apart by forces it had not anticipated. And yet, despite that fragmentation, there was resilience in the signal, a refusal to go silent, a determination to be heard even across the vast emptiness that separated them. Infinity altered its course with calculated precision, its engines humming with restrained power as it moved toward the strongest concentration of transmissions, a location that stood out not because it was stable, but because it was persistent, a signal that had endured despite interference, despite degradation, despite whatever threats had tried to silence it. The journey through the cluster revealed more than just distance, because the deeper they traveled, the more the environment itself began to change, subtle gravitational distortions bending starlight in unnatural ways, faint energy signatures drifting through space like the echoes of something long dormant, and scattered debris fields that bore the unmistakable scars of conflict. Fragments of ships that did not match any known UNSC design, their hulls marked by weapon signatures that spoke of technology both advanced and unfamiliar. Within the Infinity, the crew adapted quickly, because adaptation was what they had been built for, what they had trained for, and though the situation was unlike anything they had encountered before, the principles remained the same: gather intelligence, establish control, prepare for contact. Spartan teams were briefed and deployed to standby positions, their armor systems recalibrated to account for environmental anomalies, while Marines secured key sections of the ship, their presence a constant reminder that even in the unknown, humanity's strength lay in its ability to organize, to respond, to endure. The AI continued to process incoming data, building a clearer picture of the cluster with each passing moment, mapping out probable routes, identifying potential threats, and flagging irregularities that demanded attention. Among those irregularities were the signals that did not belong to the initiative, transmissions that operated on entirely different frequencies, structured with a precision that suggested a centralized authority, a force that was not scattered or struggling, but coordinated and expanding. These signals carried patterns of repetition, of command and response, of something that was actively moving through the cluster with purpose, and though their content remained partially obscured, the fragments that could be interpreted hinted at a hierarchy, a system of control that extended beyond individual ships or outposts. The presence of such a force introduced a new variable into the equation, one that could not be ignored, because it suggested that whatever had destabilized the initiative was not merely environmental, but deliberate. As Infinity approached the source of the human transmission, the first visual confirmation came not as a welcoming sight, but as a stark representation of struggle, a station orbiting a partially terraformed world, its structure incomplete, sections of its exterior still exposed to the vacuum, construction halted in places where it should have continued, as though progress itself had been interrupted by something sudden and violent. The planet below showed signs of habitation, clusters of structures scattered across its surface, but even from orbit it was clear that this was not a thriving colony, the patterns of development uneven, the infrastructure strained, the entire settlement balanced on the edge of sustainability. The station transmitted a response almost immediately upon detecting Infinity, its signal surging with a mix of urgency and disbelief, the operators on the other end clearly struggling to process what they were seeing, because a ship of that size, of that configuration, did not fit into any known framework of their reality. Identification protocols were initiated, codes exchanged, and though there were discrepancies, differences in encryption and structure that reflected the divergence between their respective origins, the core truth emerged quickly enough, that both sides were human, separated not just by distance, but by history itself. The initial exchange was cautious, measured, each side probing for intent as much as identity, because in a galaxy defined by uncertainty, trust was not given freely, it was earned through verification and restraint. Infinity's command made it clear that they had arrived unexpectedly, that their presence was not part of any planned expansion into this galaxy, and that their primary objective was to establish contact and gather information. The response from the station carried a mixture of relief and tension, because while the arrival of such a powerful vessel represented potential salvation, it also introduced the possibility of disruption, of a force so far beyond their current capabilities that it could reshape their fragile balance in ways they could not control. As communication deepened, the reality of the initiative's situation became impossible to ignore, because the stories that emerged were not of exploration and discovery, but of loss and adaptation, of arcs that had arrived damaged or incomplete, of leadership structures that had fractured under pressure, of worlds that had proven hostile despite initial promise. And woven through those accounts was a recurring presence, a name that surfaced again and again in reports of conflict and disappearance, a force that had engaged them not as equals, but as targets, a species that did not negotiate, did not coexist, but instead imposed its will through assimilation and control. The Kett. The name carried weight even before its full meaning was understood, because it was always associated with escalation, with encounters that began with observation and ended with violence, with technology that seemed to evolve through the very act of conquest. Data packets transmitted from the station included sensor logs, combat recordings, and fragmented intelligence reports, each one adding another layer to the emerging picture of an adversary that operated with a singular focus: expansion through transformation, turning other species into extensions of itself through a process that defied conventional biology. For Infinity, this information was more than just context, it was a warning, because the presence of such an enemy meant that their arrival had not gone unnoticed, that the same signals they had detected earlier likely belonged to this force, and that a ship of their size, their capability, would not simply be ignored, it would be studied, tested, and eventually challenged. The question was not if contact would occur, but when, and under what circumstances. The station's operators made it clear that they could not offer protection, that their resources were stretched too thin to support even their own survival, and yet there was an unspoken hope in their transmissions, a belief that Infinity represented something they had not had since their arrival in this galaxy, a chance to shift the balance, to push back against a threat that had until now been unstoppable. But with that hope came uncertainty, because the introduction of such overwhelming power into a delicate ecosystem could have consequences as dangerous as the threat it opposed. As Infinity held position above the station, its massive silhouette casting a shadow across the incomplete structures below, the crew faced a reality that extended far beyond their initial shock of displacement, because they were no longer just lost, they were present in a galaxy already defined by conflict, already shaped by forces that would not simply step aside in the face of something new. The signals they had followed had led them to humanity, but they had also revealed the existence of an enemy that would inevitably test them, and in that moment, as systems stabilized and preparations intensified, the first true phase of their arrival began to take shape. Because somewhere in the depths of the Helios Cluster, the Kett had already begun to notice that something new had entered their domain, something that did not fit into their understanding of the galaxy, something that resisted easy classification, and as their networks processed the anomaly, as their commanders evaluated the implications, the quiet tension that had settled over Infinity's arrival began to shift into something far more dangerous, the slow, inevitable approach of a confrontation. That would define everything that came next. The first indication that the Kett had taken notice did not arrive as an immediate assault or a dramatic declaration of intent, but as something far more calculated, far more unsettling in its restraint, a shift in the pattern of signals moving through the Helios Cluster, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the background noise of a galaxy already filled with conflict, but unmistakable once Infinity's systems began to isolate and track the changes, because what had once been scattered and exploratory transmissions began to converge, to focus, to form a lattice of communication that oriented itself toward a single point in space, the position of the UNSC Infinity. Within the command decks of the massive supercarrier, the data unfolded with quiet inevitability, each new transmission adding another layer to the emerging pattern, until it became clear that this was not random movement, not the chaotic activity of independent forces, but the coordinated response of an organized entity that had identified Infinity as something worthy of attention, something that required observation before engagement. The Kett were not rushing blindly toward confrontation, they were studying, probing the boundaries of this new variable in their domain, and that alone made them far more dangerous than a simple enemy that relied on brute force. Far beyond the incomplete station orbiting the fragile human colony, in regions of space where initiative sensors rarely reached and survival itself was uncertain, Kett vessels adjusted their trajectories with precise intent, their movements guided by a hierarchy that extended through every level of their structure. Their ships, organic yet mechanical in design, pulsed with a cold, methodical energy as they shifted formation, long-range scanners focusing on the anomaly that had disrupted the balance of their operations. To them, Infinity was not merely a threat, not yet, but a question, and in the Kett philosophy, questions were meant to be answered through acquisition, through understanding, and ultimately through transformation. The first probe came without warning, a small detachment of Kett vessels emerging from the darkness at the edge of Infinity's sensor range, their approach neither aggressive nor passive, but deliberate, a controlled advance that maintained distance while establishing a presence. Their ships emitted low-frequency pulses that brushed against Infinity's shields, not with the force of an attack, but with the precision of a scan, as though they were attempting to map the structure of the vessel without triggering a defensive response. The interaction was subtle, almost surgical, but it carried an underlying tension that permeated every deck of the supercarrier, because it was clear that this was not curiosity born of chance, but the first step in a larger process. Infinity responded as it had been designed to, with controlled escalation, its own sensors locking onto the incoming vessels, analyzing their composition, their energy signatures, their movement patterns, and the results were as intriguing as they were concerning. Kett technology did not align cleanly with any known system, its integration of biological and mechanical elements creating signatures that shifted in ways conventional models struggled to interpret. Their propulsion systems left trails of distorted energy that did not behave like standard Mass Effect drives, and their hulls exhibited properties that suggested adaptive materials, capable of responding to external stimuli in real time. This was not an enemy that relied on static design. This was a force that evolved even in the act of observation. The distance between the two forces held for several tense minutes, a silent exchange of data and intent that played out across invisible spectrums, until the balance shifted. A single Kett vessel broke formation, its trajectory altering in a smooth, deliberate arc that brought it closer to Infinity's outer perimeter, crossing the threshold that separated observation from intrusion. The moment it did, Infinity's defensive systems reacted automatically, energy shields intensifying, targeting solutions locking into place, and within the command center, the decision that had been inevitable from the start finally took shape. The first shot was not fired in panic, nor in anger, but in clarity, a calculated response to an encroachment that could not be allowed to continue unchecked. One of Infinity's secondary Mach cannons discharged with controlled precision, the kinetic projectile tearing through the void with devastating speed, and when it struck the approaching Kett vessel, the result was immediate and absolute. The ship did not simply break apart. It was obliterated, its structure unable to withstand the sheer force of the impact, fragments dispersing into space as residual energy flared and dissipated. For a brief moment, there was stillness, the kind that follows a decisive action, where the consequences have not yet fully manifested, but are already inevitable. Then the Kett responded. The remaining vessels shifted formation instantly, their previous restraint giving way to coordinated aggression, energy signatures spiking as weapons systems came online, and without hesitation, they opened fire. Their weapons did not resemble the clean, focused blasts of human technology, but rather streams of charged energy that pulsed and twisted as they traveled, impacting Infinity's shields with a force that, while insufficient to penetrate, was far from negligible. The supercarrier's defenses flared under the assault, absorbing the impacts with resilience that spoke to its design, but the message was clear: the Kett had moved from observation to engagement, and they would not retreat without extracting something of value from this encounter. Infinity's response escalated in tandem, its full array of weapon systems coming online as it transitioned from passive observation to active combat. Archer missile pods deployed in rapid succession, their projectiles streaking toward the Kett formation with guided precision, while additional Mach rounds fired in staggered intervals, each one aimed to disrupt the cohesion of the enemy fleet. The battle unfolded with a stark imbalance of power, because while the Kett ships demonstrated agility and adaptability, they were not built to withstand the kind of overwhelming force Infinity could deliver. One by one, their vessels were struck, damaged, or destroyed, their formations breaking under the sustained assault. And yet, even as they lost ships, the Kett did not retreat in disarray. Their movements remained controlled, their responses measured, as though the engagement itself was serving a purpose beyond immediate victory or defeat. Data was being gathered in real time, transmitted through their network, every impact, every defensive reaction, every fluctuation in Infinity's systems analyzed and catalogued. They were learning, even in loss, even in destruction, and that made the encounter far more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. The battle ended as abruptly as it had begun, the remaining Kett vessels disengaging with calculated precision, retreating into the depths of the cluster without pursuing a prolonged fight. They had tested the Infinity, measured its capabilities, and while they had suffered significant losses, the exchange had given them something far more valuable than a temporary victory. It had given them knowledge. Within Infinity, the aftermath was assessed with equal intensity, damage reports confirming that their shields had held, that their systems remained fully operational, and that their superiority in raw firepower had been demonstrated beyond question. But beneath that surface confidence lay a deeper understanding, one that had begun to take shape even before the last Kett ship vanished from sensor range. This had not been a full assault. It had been a probe. The implications of that realization extended far beyond the immediate engagement, because it meant that the Kett were not acting on impulse, but on strategy, that they would adapt, evolve, and return with a response tailored specifically to counter what they had just encountered. Infinity had revealed its strength, but in doing so, it had also exposed itself to an enemy that thrived on understanding and assimilation. Far from the battlefield, within the depths of Kett-controlled space, the data transmitted from the surviving vessels was received and processed, integrated into a growing body of knowledge that defined their approach to conquest. The anomaly had been confirmed as a threat, but more importantly as an opportunity, something that could be studied, broken down, and ultimately incorporated into their expansion. The concept of a vessel like Infinity, of soldiers enhanced beyond natural limits, of technology that operated outside their established framework, presented possibilities that could not be ignored. The directive that followed was not one of immediate annihilation, but of escalation, a decision to pursue deeper engagement, to capture rather than destroy, to learn rather than simply eliminate. The Infinity had proven its strength, but in doing so, it had also marked itself as something worth taking. Back within the Helios Cluster, as Infinity resumed its position near the struggling human station, the weight of that encounter settled into something far more permanent. Because the first contact with the Kett had not ended the threat, it had only begun it, setting into motion a conflict that would grow more complex, more dangerous, and more personal with every passing moment. And in that growing tension, one truth became impossible to ignore, that the arrival of the UNSC Infinity had not simply changed the balance of power in this galaxy, it had awakened something that would not rest until that power was understood, challenged, and ultimately claimed. The aftermath of the first engagement lingered not as silence, but as a charged stillness, the kind that follows a revelation too significant to ignore, because what had unfolded between the UNSC Infinity and the Kett was not merely a battle, but a collision of entirely different philosophies of power, two technological lineages meeting for the first time under conditions neither had been designed to anticipate. As the Infinity held its position above the struggling Initiative outpost, its systems cycling through post-combat diagnostics and recalibrations, the data gathered from that brief but decisive encounter began to reveal something far more complex than a simple advantage in firepower, because the interaction between Kett technology and Infinity's Forerunner-enhanced systems had produced anomalies that could not be easily explained within the framework of either civilization. Deep within the ship's analytical cores, streams of combat telemetry were broken down and reconstructed, every exchange of energy, every fluctuation in shield integrity, every moment of contact between weapon and defense scrutinized with relentless precision, and what emerged from that analysis was a pattern of interference that went beyond standard physical interaction, subtle distortions in energy behavior that suggested the presence of overlapping principles, as though the laws governing mass effect fields and the physics underlying slipspace technology were not entirely incompatible, but instead intersected in ways that created unpredictable results. The Kett weapons, though unable to breach Infinity's shields, had triggered localized fluctuations within the defensive grid, brief instabilities that resolved almost instantly but left behind traces of something deeper, a resonance that hinted at a connection between systems that should have had no common ground. At the same time, Infinity's own weapons had not behaved entirely as expected when interacting with Kett vessels, because while the destructive power of the Mach rounds remained absolute, the energy dispersion patterns that followed each impact showed irregularities, deviations from standard models that suggested the Kett hulls were not simply absorbing or deflecting force, but responding to it, adapting at a structural level even in the moment of destruction. This was not resilience in the traditional sense, but something closer to evolution compressed into seconds, a biological mechanical response that allowed the Kett to gather information even as their ships were torn apart, feeding that data back into their collective understanding. Beyond the immediate analysis of the battle, another layer of complexity began to emerge from Infinity's deeper scans of the surrounding region, where the subtle energy signatures that had been present since their arrival started to align with something more structured, more deliberate. These were not random anomalies, but remnants of a vast and ancient network, signals embedded within the very fabric of the cluster that pulsed with a rhythm unlike anything the UNSC had encountered before. As those signals were mapped and compared, a startling correlation began to take shape, because their patterns bore a resemblance, however distant, to the architecture of Forerunner systems, not in design, but in intent, in the way they interfaced with the environment, in the way they extended influence across space without relying on conventional transmission. The source of those signals lay deeper within the cluster, tied to structures that the Initiative had only partially understood, constructs known as remnant vaults, relics of a civilization that had long since vanished but left behind technology that continued to operate with a purpose that remained largely unexplained. Infinity's sensors, far more advanced than anything the Initiative possessed, began to probe those structures from a distance, and what they found was both intriguing and unsettling, because the vaults were not dormant, not in any meaningful sense, but active in a way that suggested ongoing processes, systems that continued to function according to directives that had never been deactivated. When the data from those scans was cross-referenced with the anomalies observed during the Kett engagement, the connection became impossible to ignore, because the same underlying patterns that defined the vaults were present, albeit faintly, in the fluctuations of Infinity's own systems during combat. It was as if the presence of the supercarrier, with its Forerunner-derived enhancements, had triggered a response within the remnant network, a recognition that extended beyond simple detection into something closer to interaction. The implications of that possibility were profound, because it suggested that Infinity was not just an outsider in this galaxy, but a catalyst, something that could influence and be influenced by the ancient systems that already existed here. This realization introduced a new dimension to the situation, one that extended far beyond the immediate threat posed by the Kett, because it meant that the arrival of Infinity had begun to alter the behavior of the galaxy itself, subtle shifts that might not yet be visible on a large scale, but were already taking shape beneath the surface. The remnant systems, long studied but never fully understood by the Initiative, were reacting in ways that suggested a level of compatibility with Forerunner technology that no one had anticipated, opening the possibility that Infinity could interface with, and potentially control, aspects of this ancient network. Within the command structure of Infinity, this information sparked a new kind of tension, one that was not driven by external threat, but by internal implication, because the potential to access and manipulate remnant technology represented an opportunity unlike anything they had encountered before, a chance to gain a level of influence over the environment that could reshape the balance of power in the Helios Cluster entirely. But with that opportunity came uncertainty, because such interaction would not be without consequence, and the lack of understanding surrounding the true purpose of the remnant systems meant that any attempt to engage with them carried risks that could not be fully calculated. At the same time, reports from the Initiative began to provide additional context, filling in the gaps that Infinity's sensors could not fully address, descriptions of vaults that could alter planetary conditions, of networks that extended across entire systems, of a hidden infrastructure that had the potential to transform hostile worlds into habitable environments. These were not weapons in the traditional sense, but tools of creation and control, systems that could shape entire ecosystems. And in a galaxy where survival depended on the ability to establish stable colonies, their value was beyond measure. Yet even as this new layer of possibility emerged, the shadow of the Kett remained ever present, because the data from the previous encounter made it clear that they would not remain passive in the face of such developments. The information they had gathered during their probe would already be influencing their next move, their strategies evolving to account for Infinity's strengths, their focus narrowing on ways to overcome or bypass its defenses. And if the Kett became aware of the connection between Infinity and the remnant systems, the situation would escalate beyond simple conflict into something far more dangerous, a race not just for dominance, but for control over the very mechanisms that define the cluster. As Infinity continued to process and integrate the growing volume of data, the nature of its presence in the Andromeda Galaxy began to shift, from that of a lost vessel seeking orientation to that of a central force within a rapidly evolving equation, one that connected advanced human military power, an adaptive and relentless enemy, and an ancient technological network whose full capabilities had yet to be revealed. The boundaries between these elements were beginning to blur, their interactions creating outcomes that none of the involved parties could fully predict, and within that uncertainty lay both the greatest opportunity and the greatest danger. Because the clash that had begun with a simple exchange of fire had already expanded into something far more complex, a convergence of technologies that did not just oppose each other, but interacted, influenced, and in some cases, resonated in ways that suggested deeper connections waiting to be uncovered. And as those connections grew stronger, as the lines between systems became less defined, one truth began to take shape with increasing clarity, that this was no longer just a battle between Infinity and the Kett, but the beginning of a transformation that would redefine the entire Helios Cluster. The arrival of the UNSC Infinity did not simply alter the balance of power within the Helios Cluster. It fractured perception itself, splitting reality into two competing interpretations that could not comfortably coexist, because where one side saw salvation descending from the stars in the form of a warship powerful enough to challenge the Kett, another saw the quiet beginning of something far more dangerous, the subtle shift from survival to dependency, from cooperation to control, from fragile autonomy to the looming possibility of domination disguised as protection. The Andromeda Initiative, worn thin by years of uncertainty, loss, and relentless pressure from hostile forces, could not help but look upon Infinity as a miracle made real, a manifestation of everything they had hoped might follow them across the dark gulf between galaxies but never truly expected to arrive. And in that hope there was relief so profound that it bordered on surrender. Within the Nexus, that relief spread like a current through every level of its population, from leadership to colonists, from engineers to security personnel, because the presence of Infinity represented not just military strength, but certainty, something the Initiative had been forced to live without since their arrival in Andromeda. Here was a ship that did not struggle to defend itself, that did not ration its capabilities, that did not face every engagement as a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. And that difference reshaped morale almost instantly, creating a renewed sense of possibility that extended beyond simple survival and into the realm of reclaiming control over their future. Outposts that had once braced for inevitable attack now operated under the assumption that reinforcements could arrive, that threats could be countered rather than endured, and that shift, subtle at first, began to redefine how the Initiative viewed its place within the cluster. But hope, when tied too closely to power that lies beyond one's control, carries with it an inherent risk, and within the upper levels of Initiative leadership, that risk was understood with increasing clarity, even as the broader population embraced the comfort Infinity provided. The chain of command that governed the Initiative had been built under conditions of scarcity and isolation, where every decision carried weight because there were no external forces to rely on, no higher authority to defer to, and that independence had shaped their identity as much as their survival. Now, with Infinity present, that identity was under quiet threat, not through force or coercion, but through the simple fact that a superior power existed, one that could, if it chose, override any decision made within the Nexus simply by virtue of its capability. Discussions within Initiative Command became more frequent, more intense, as leaders debated the implications of Infinity's presence, not in terms of immediate benefit, which was undeniable, but in terms of long-term consequence. Some argued that integration was the only logical path forward, that aligning fully with the UNSC structure would provide the stability and security the Initiative had lacked since its arrival, effectively transforming their fragile foothold into a defensible, sustainable presence within the cluster. Others resisted that notion, pointing out that such alignment would come at the cost of autonomy, that the initiative would cease to be an independent entity and instead become an extension of a military power whose priorities might not always align with their own. This division was not clean or easily resolved, because both perspectives were rooted in valid concerns, and as those concerns clashed, the unity that had allowed the initiative to endure began to show signs of strain. The presence of Infinity had not simply added strength to their position, it had introduced a question that could not be answered without fundamentally redefining who they were. Aboard Infinity, a similar divide was taking shape, though it manifested in a different form, shaped by the structure and discipline of the UNSC but no less significant in its implications. Command understood that they were operating far beyond the scope of their original mission parameters, no longer bound to the context of the Milky Way, no longer accountable to a central authority that could provide guidance or limitation, and that absence of oversight created a vacuum in which decisions carried far greater weight. The question was no longer what orders to follow, but what principles should guide them in a galaxy where they represented the most powerful force present. Within that vacuum, three distinct philosophies began to emerge, each offering a different vision of how Infinity should proceed, and each carrying consequences that would shape the future of the Heleus Cluster in profoundly different ways. There were those who believed that Infinity's role should be purely protective, that their responsibility was to safeguard human life within the initiative without interfering in the broader political or social structures of the cluster, effectively acting as a shield rather than a governing force. This perspective emphasized restraint, caution, and the preservation of the initiative's independence, recognizing that even well-intentioned intervention could lead to unintended domination. Opposing this view were those who saw Infinity's arrival as an opportunity that could not be wasted, a chance to establish a structured, stable presence within the cluster by leveraging their technological and military superiority to impose order where chaos had previously reigned. From this perspective, the initiative's struggles were evidence that their current approach was insufficient, that survival alone was not enough, and that without a stronger guiding hand, they would remain vulnerable to forces like the Kett indefinitely. To these individuals, the idea of remaining passive in the face of such potential was not just inefficient, but irresponsible. Between these positions lay a third path, one that sought to maintain independence not just from the initiative, but from any form of entanglement that might limit Infinity's ability to act according to its own strategic priorities. This perspective viewed the Helios Cluster not as a home to be integrated into, but as an environment to be navigated, one in which Infinity could operate as a sovereign entity, engaging with other factions when beneficial, but ultimately remaining separate, preserving its autonomy above all else. It was a stance rooted in caution, shaped by the understanding that involvement in unfamiliar systems could lead to complications that extended far beyond immediate concerns. These philosophies did not exist in isolation, but intersected and overlapped, influencing decisions at every level of command, creating an undercurrent of tension that ran beneath the surface of Infinity's operations. Every action taken, every resource allocated, every engagement considered was filtered through these competing viewpoints, and while discipline ensured that orders were followed and operations continued smoothly, the lack of consensus created a sense of uncertainty that could not be ignored. As this internal debate unfolded, the initiative remained largely unaware of the depth of division within Infinity's command structure, seeing only the results of their actions, the protection they provided, the presence they maintained, and interpreting those results through their own lens of hope and necessity. But the longer Infinity remained within the cluster, the more those internal divisions would begin to manifest externally, shaping interactions, influencing decisions, and ultimately determining the nature of the relationship between the two groups. Because the truth that neither side could fully escape was that Infinity's presence was not a neutral factor, it was a force of change, and change, no matter how beneficial it might appear in the moment, always carries with it consequences that extend beyond immediate perception. The initiative's hope could become dependence, their cooperation could become subordination, and Infinity's protection could become control, not through intention, but through the gradual accumulation of decisions made under pressure, each one shifting the balance just slightly until the difference became undeniable. And in the vast silence of the Helios Cluster, where no higher authority existed to define what was right or wrong, where no external force could impose limits or offer guidance, those decisions would be made by those who held the power to act, shaping the future not just of humanity in Andromeda, but of every species that would come to exist alongside them. A future that was no longer uncertain because of what might happen, but because of who would decide. Even as the debate over Infinity's role deepened within both the initiative and its own command structure, forces beyond their immediate awareness had already begun to move, drawn not by hope or ideology, but by opportunity, because in a galaxy where power had been fragmented and survival dictated by adaptability, the sudden arrival of a warship capable of altering the balance so dramatically was not simply an event to be observed, it was a resource to be exploited, a threat to be neutralized, or a weapon to be redirected depending on who moved first and how effectively they acted. The exiles, scattered yet persistent, understood this better than most. Their existence built upon navigating instability, leveraging chaos, and seizing advantage wherever it presented itself, and to them, Infinity was not a symbol of salvation, but a variable that could either secure their dominance or erase them entirely. Within the hidden enclaves and drifting strongholds that defined exile territory, discussions unfolded with a clarity born from necessity, because unlike the initiative, they did not have the luxury of hope, only calculation. They had survived the collapse of order once before, carving out their own place in a hostile galaxy through force, cunning, and ruthless pragmatism, and they recognized immediately that Infinity represented a return of the very structure they had rejected, a centralized power capable of imposing rules, enforcing authority, and dismantling the fragile independence they had fought to maintain. To allow such a force to integrate uncontested was, in their view, to invite their own extinction. But direct confrontation was not an option, not against a vessel of Infinity's scale and capability, and so their strategies took a different form, one rooted in misdirection, infiltration, and manipulation, methods that had served them well in a galaxy where brute force alone was rarely enough to secure victory. Plans were formed not to destroy Infinity outright, but to destabilize it, to introduce uncertainty, to exploit the very divisions that were already forming within its command structure, because a fractured enemy is far easier to influence than a unified one. Information became their first weapon, fragments of intelligence gathered through observation, intercepted communications, and carefully placed agents, all of it analyzed for patterns, weaknesses, opportunities where perception could be altered just enough to create doubt. Rumors began to circulate within the fringes of initiative space, subtle at first, then growing more defined, stories suggesting that Infinity's true purpose was not protection, but control, that its presence marked the beginning of a new hierarchy in which those who resisted would be quietly sidelined or removed. These narratives, though unproven, found fertile ground in a population already struggling with uncertainty, amplifying existing concerns and deepening the divide between those who embraced Infinity and those who feared it. At the same time, more direct efforts were set into motion, attempts to probe Infinity's defenses not through open attack, but through infiltration, small-scale incursions designed to test response times, security protocols, and potential vulnerabilities. These were not reckless assaults, but calculated risks, carried out by individuals willing to operate in the shadows, to slip through the edges of a system that, while advanced, was not designed for the specific kind of asymmetrical tactics the exiles specialized in. Each attempt, whether successful or not, provided data, insights that could be used to refine future efforts, building a clearer picture of how Infinity could be influenced or, at the very least, disrupted. Beyond human factions, another perspective was taking shape, one that carried its own weight and consequence, because the Angara, native to the cluster and deeply connected to its history, did not view Infinity through the same lens as the Initiative or the exiles. To them, the arrival of such a vessel was not just a shift in power, but a continuation of a pattern they knew all too well, the intrusion of an external force whose strength far exceeded that of those already present, bringing with it the implicit threat of domination, regardless of its stated intentions. The Angaran leadership, already cautious in their dealings with the Initiative, began to reassess their position as new information about Infinity's capabilities spread, their concerns rooted not in speculation, but in experience, because they had seen what happened when power was concentrated in the hands of those who believed their cause justified their actions. The Kett were the most extreme example of this, their expansion driven by a rigid ideology that left no room for coexistence. But the underlying principle, that overwhelming strength often led to imposed control, was not unique to them. Meetings among Angron leaders became more frequent. Their discussions focused not on immediate reaction, but on long-term implications, on what Infinity's presence meant for the future of their people, and whether alignment with humanity would ultimately lead to protection or subjugation. Some argued that cooperation was necessary, that Infinity represented the best chance of countering the Kett effectively, and that rejecting such an alliance would be both impractical and dangerous. Others were far less certain, pointing out that reliance on an external power had historically led to loss of autonomy, and that even well-intentioned allies could become oppressors if left unchecked. This uncertainty began to influence their interactions with the Initiative, introducing a layer of caution that had not been as pronounced before. Their willingness to share information, resources, and strategic support tempered by the need to ensure that they were not inadvertently strengthening a force that could later turn against them. Trust, already fragile, became even more conditional. Each decision weighed not just for its immediate benefit, but for its potential long-term consequences. Caught between these shifting dynamics, Infinity found itself at the center of a growing web of perception and manipulation, its actions interpreted differently by each faction, its intentions questioned, its presence reshaping the political landscape in ways that extended far beyond direct conflict. The exiles sought to undermine it, the Angara sought to understand and contain it, and the Initiative struggled to reconcile their dependence on it with their desire for independence. And within Infinity itself, these external pressures began to feed back into the internal divisions that had already taken root, reinforcing arguments, validating concerns, and complicating decisions that were already difficult to navigate. Reports of exile activity, of attempted infiltrations and spreading disinformation, strengthened the case for a more assertive stance, for taking control of the situation before it could spiral further. At the same time, the growing caution from the Angara served as a warning, a reminder that too strong a response could confirm the very fears that were beginning to take hold. The result was a delicate, increasingly unstable balance, one in which every action carried multiple interpretations. Every decision had the potential to either stabilize or destabilize the situation further, and every delay allowed opposing forces more time to act. Infinity was no longer just a military asset, it had become a symbol, a focal point around which the future of the Heleus Cluster was beginning to revolve, and that role came with a level of scrutiny and consequence that could not be ignored. Because in a galaxy shaped by conflict, memory, and survival, power is never viewed in isolation. It is judged by what it has done, what it is doing, and what it might do, and for Infinity, that judgment was still being formed, influenced not just by its actions, but by the shadows cast by those who sought to shape perception to their advantage. And in those shadows, the true battle for control had already begun, not with fleets and weapons, but with belief, trust, and the fragile line between protector and oppressor. The Kett did not react to the arrival of the UNSC Infinity with fear, nor with hesitation, because their empire had never been built upon either of those instincts, but instead upon a singular, unyielding philosophy that had guided every expansion, every conquest, and every transformation they had ever undertaken, the belief that all life could be improved, elevated, perfected through the process they called exaltation, and that any resistance to this process was not an obstacle, but an inevitability waiting to be overcome. Where others saw Infinity as a warship, as a symbol of power or a potential ally or threat, the Kett saw something far more valuable, a source of biological and technological advancement that could accelerate their evolution in ways they had not previously encountered, and in that recognition, a new directive was formed, one that would reshape their approach to the conflict within the Helios Cluster entirely. This directive was not broadcast openly, not declared with the kind of visible mobilization that might alert their enemies to its significance, but instead disseminated through the structured hierarchy of Kett command, encoded within orders that appeared routine on the surface but carried deeper implications for those who understood their true purpose. The Archon, already driven by an obsessive pursuit of remnant technology, now shifted a portion of that focus toward a new objective, one that combined the biological uniqueness of humanity, and more specifically Spartans, with the technological sophistication of the UNSC, creating a convergence of elements that the Kett had never before encountered in a single target. Initial encounters between Kett forces and UNSC personnel had already yielded data, fragmented but sufficient to indicate that these new humans were not equivalent to those the Initiative had brought to Andromeda. Their physical capabilities, their resilience, their integration with advanced armor systems, all pointed to deliberate enhancement, a refinement of the human form that aligned disturbingly well with the Kett's own goals. But where the Kett relied on external transformation, on the imposition of change through exaltation, the Spartans represented something different, an internal evolution, a controlled augmentation that preserved identity while enhancing capability. To the Kett, this was not just intriguing, it was revolutionary. The possibility of integrating Spartan biology into the exaltation process suggested outcomes that extended far beyond simple improvement, hinting at a new class of being, one that combined the adaptability of their existing methods with the stability and efficiency demonstrated by UNSC augmentation. It was not enough to observe such potential from a distance. It had to be acquired, dissected, understood, and ultimately replicated. Thus, the nature of Kett operations began to change. Where previous engagements had focused on domination and conversion, overwhelming force applied to secure captives for exaltation, the new directive emphasized precision, targeting specific individuals, isolating units, and extracting them with minimal damage. Spartans, in particular, became high-priority targets, their capture deemed of greater value than the destruction of entire enemy formations. This shift required a level of coordination and restraint that was not typical of Kett assault doctrine, forcing adaptations in their tactics as they sought to balance aggression with control. The first true manifestation of this directive occurred during what initially appeared to be a standard skirmish along a contested supply route, a location where Initiative convoys had previously been harassed by Kett patrols, but never with significant escalation. This time, however, the engagement unfolded differently, the Kett forces deploying not in overwhelming numbers, but in calculated formations designed to channel movement, to separate targets from support, and to create opportunities for capture rather than annihilation. UNSC forces, operating alongside Initiative personnel, quickly recognized that something was off, the pattern of attack lacking the chaotic intensity they had come to associate with Kett engagements. Instead, there was a focus, a deliberate narrowing of attention towards specific individuals, particularly those whose armor signatures matched Spartan profiles. Fire teams reported coordinated attempts to disable rather than destroy, to isolate rather than eliminate, and within moments, the implications became clear. They're trying to take us alive. The realization spread across the battlefield with chilling speed, altering the dynamic of the engagement instantly, because fighting an enemy that seeks your destruction is one thing, but facing one that intends to capture and transform you into something else entirely is another. UNSC doctrine adapted accordingly, shifting from standard engagement protocols to counter-capture measures, prioritizing mobility, maintaining tight unit cohesion, and deploying defensive tactics designed to prevent isolation. Even so, the Kett were prepared. Specialized units, equipped with containment technology and supported by suppressive fire, moved with precision through the battlefield, exploiting every opening, every moment of separation, every lapse in coordination. They did not rush, did not overextend, but advanced methodically, their movements guided by data gathered from previous encounters, their strategies refined to counter the specific strengths of their new targets. The result was a conflict that felt fundamentally different, less like a battle for territory and more like a hunt. Aboard the UNSC Infinity, reports from the engagement triggered immediate concern, not just because of the tactical implications, but because of what it revealed about the Kett's evolving strategy. This was no longer a simple adversary applying brute force. It was an enemy that learned, that adapted, that identified value and adjusted its approach to secure it. The idea that Spartans, humanity's most advanced soldiers, could become targets for assimilation introduced a level of urgency that could not be ignored. Command analysis quickly identified the broader risk, that if the Kett succeeded even once, if they managed to capture and successfully integrate Spartan biology into their exaltation process, the consequences would extend far beyond a single loss. It would represent a shift in their capabilities, a potential leap forward that could produce enemies capable of matching or even surpassing UNSC forces in both physical and technological terms. Containment of this directive became a priority. But containment required understanding, and understanding required engagement. As Infinity began to adjust its operational focus, deploying reconnaissance assets and refining its own tactics to counter the evolving Kett threat, the initiative found itself once again caught in the ripple effects of a conflict that was growing more complex by the moment. Information about the Kett's new behaviors spread quickly, not just through official channels, but through the same informal networks that had carried previous concerns, amplifying fear and uncertainty. For many within the initiative, the idea that the Kett were now targeting UNSC forces, specifically Spartans, introduced a new and unsettling dimension to the conflict, because it suggested that Infinity's presence had not only brought protection, but also escalation, drawing the attention of an enemy that might otherwise have remained focused elsewhere. Among the Angara, this development reinforced existing concerns in a different way, highlighting the unpredictable nature of external influences on the cluster. The Kett's adaptation was seen not just as a response to Infinity, but as evidence that the introduction of new variables could destabilize existing patterns in ways that were difficult to anticipate or control. And in the shadows, the exiles watched. To them, this was confirmation of a principle they had long understood, that power attracts conflict, that the arrival of something as significant as Infinity would inevitably trigger reactions from forces seeking to either harness or neutralize it. The Kett's directive aligned perfectly with this understanding, transforming Infinity from a stabilizing presence into a focal point of escalation. Opportunities began to emerge from this shift. If the Kett were focused on capturing UNSC assets, then their attention could be redirected, manipulated, used to create openings elsewhere. If Infinity was forced to concentrate its efforts on protecting its own, then its ability to project power across the cluster would be limited, creating gaps that could be exploited. The web of conflict tightened. Every faction was now reacting not just to Infinity, but to each other, their decisions intersecting in ways that amplified complexity and reduced predictability. The initiative sought stability, the Angara sought assurance, the exiles sought advantage, and the Kett sought evolution, each objective influencing the others in a continuous loop of cause and effect. And at the center of it all, the UNSC Infinity stood not just as a participant, but as the catalyst that had brought these forces into alignment, whether by intention or by consequence. Because the Kett Adaptation Directive was not simply a tactical adjustment, it was a declaration of intent, a signal that the conflict within the Helios Cluster had entered a new phase, one defined not just by survival or domination, but by transformation. A phase where the cost of failure would not be measured solely in lives lost, but in what those lives could become if captured. And in that reality, the line between soldier and resource had never been more dangerously thin. There are moments in the evolution of a galaxy when the introduction of a single force does not simply alter events, but begins to rewrite the very structure through which those events unfold, shifting power not in increments, but in waves that ripple outward, touching every system, every faction, every fragile agreement that once defined stability. And in the Helios Cluster, that moment had already begun long before anyone was willing to fully acknowledge it, because the arrival of the UNSC Infinity was never just an addition to the existing balance, it was a disruption so profound that the concept of balance itself began to fracture under its presence. At first, the changes had been subtle, almost imperceptible, manifesting in the small decisions made by leaders trying to adapt to new variables, the quiet recalculations of risk and opportunity, the cautious adjustments in diplomacy that reflected uncertainty more than confidence. But as Infinity's influence expanded, those subtle shifts began to compound, layering upon one another until they formed something far more significant, a transformation that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as temporary. The initiative, which had once struggled to establish even the most basic footholds in a hostile and unfamiliar galaxy, now found itself operating under the shadow of a power that could defend entire sectors, deploy forces with unprecedented speed, and counter threats that had previously seemed insurmountable. Outposts that would have once been considered vulnerable now operated with a degree of confidence that bordered on boldness, their expansion efforts accelerating as the perceived risk of annihilation diminished. But confidence, when built too quickly, often obscures the cost at which it is gained. Because with every system secured under the protective reach of infinity, with every Kett advance halted or reversed by the intervention of its forces, the initiative became increasingly dependent on a power that it did not control, a reliance that began to reshape not just its strategy, but its identity. Decisions that had once been made out of necessity were now influenced by expectation, the assumption that infinity would be there, that it would respond, that it would intervene. And in that assumption, something fundamental began to change. Autonomy, once a defining principle of the initiative's mission, began to erode, not through coercion, but through convenience, because it is easier to rely on strength than to struggle against overwhelming odds, easier to accept protection than to risk failure, and over time, that ease becomes habit, and habit becomes dependence. Among the Angara, the perception of this shift was far more immediate, far more personal, because they had lived through the consequences of imbalance before, had seen what happens when a dominant force reshapes the galaxy according to its own logic, regardless of the intentions behind it. To them, infinity's growing influence was not just a matter of military capability, but of precedent, a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar even if its origins were different. At first, their concerns had been measured, expressed through cautious diplomacy and requests for clarity, but as infinity's presence became more pronounced, as its interventions began to determine the outcomes of conflicts that would have otherwise unfolded differently, those concerns deepened into something more urgent, more difficult to reconcile with the cooperation they had established with the initiative. Because even if infinity acted with the intent to protect, the effect of its actions was to concentrate power in a way that no single entity in the cluster had ever possessed before. And power, once concentrated, rarely remains neutral. This reality became undeniable during a coordinated operation that would come to define the turning point in Helios' shifting balance, an engagement that began as a response to a Kett incursion but evolved into something far more consequential. Intelligence had identified a Kett stronghold positioned at a critical junction, a location that allowed them to project force across multiple systems, disrupting trade routes, isolating outposts, and maintaining pressure on both initiative and Angaran territories. The decision to strike was not controversial. What was controversial was how that strike would be carried out. The initiative, in coordination with Angaran forces, had initially planned a multi-phase assault, one that relied on precision, coordination, and a balance of contributions that ensured no single faction dominated the operation. It was a plan that reflected not just tactical considerations, but political ones, an acknowledgement that how the battle was fought mattered just as much as its outcome. Infinity's involvement changed that equation entirely. With its ability to deploy overwhelming force, to neutralize defenses, and to secure objectives in a fraction of the time, the temptation to accelerate the operation became impossible to ignore. What had been planned as a coordinated effort began to shift toward a more direct approach, one where Infinity would take the lead, leveraging its capabilities to ensure a decisive and efficient victory. From a purely military perspective, the logic was sound. From a broader perspective, it was transformative. Because when Infinity engaged, it did not fight as part of a coalition, it fought as a force unto itself, its presence redefining the battlefield, its actions dictating the flow of conflict in a way that left little room for others to operate independently. Angaran forces, despite their skill and determination, found themselves adapting to Infinity's movements rather than contributing equally, their role shifting from co-combatants to support elements within a battle that was no longer truly shared. The Kett, for their part, responded with the same adaptability that had come to define them, reinforcing their positions, deploying countermeasures, and attempting to exploit any perceived weakness. But even their efforts were shaped by Infinity's dominance. Their strategies focused not on the coalition as a whole, but on the singular threat that now stood at its center. The battle was won. Decisively. Efficiently. And in many ways, undeniably. But victory, as it turned out, was only part of the outcome. Because in the aftermath, as the debris of conflict settled and the immediate threat was removed, The implications of how that victory had been achieved began to surface, not in official reports, but in the perceptions of those who had witnessed it, those who had felt the shift firsthand. Among the initiative, there was pride, relief, and a growing sense of security, reinforced by the knowledge that with Infinity's support, challenges that had once seemed insurmountable could now be overcome. But beneath that confidence was an unspoken recognition, a quiet awareness that their role in the galaxy was changing, that they were no longer pioneers carving out a future through resilience alone, but participants in a system increasingly defined by external power. Among the Angara, the reaction was far more complex. Gratitude existed, undeniably, for the defeat of a shared enemy, but it was accompanied by unease, by the realization that the balance they had fought to preserve was shifting in ways that placed them at a disadvantage, not through hostility, but through disparity. The battlefield had shown them what Infinity could do, how quickly it could alter the course of events, and in that demonstration, a question emerged that could not be easily answered. What happens when such power is no longer aligned with their interests? Aboard Infinity itself, the consequences of the operation reverberated through its command structure, amplifying the debates that had been building since their arrival. For those who believed in decisive action, the success of the operation was validation, proof that their capabilities could bring stability to a chaotic environment, that intervention, when applied effectively, could save lives and secure the future. But for others, the same success raised concerns that were far more difficult to dismiss, because it highlighted not just what Infinity could do, but what it was becoming, a central force around which the entire cluster was beginning to revolve. And in that role, intention mattered less than impact. Because even the most well-meaning intervention can destabilize a system if it disrupts the balance upon which that system depends, and the Helios Cluster, already fragile from years of conflict and uncertainty, was now being reshaped by a presence that operated on an entirely different scale. The exiles, ever perceptive, recognized this shift immediately, understanding that the true impact of Infinity was not just in the battles it won, but in the dependencies it created, the perceptions it altered, and the divisions it deepened. Where others saw protection, they saw opportunity, because imbalance, once introduced, can be exploited in ways that stability cannot. They began to adapt their strategies accordingly, focusing not on direct confrontation, but on amplification, leveraging the growing tensions between factions, feeding narratives that emphasized inequality, that questioned motives, that framed Infinity not as a guardian, but as an emerging power whose influence would eventually extend beyond protection into control. And the most dangerous part of that narrative was not that it was entirely false, but that it contained enough truth to be believed. Because the question at the heart of it all, the one that no faction could fully answer, the one that lingered beneath every decision, every alliance, every conflict, was not about what Infinity intended to do, but about what its presence was inevitably causing. Were they saving the galaxy? Or were they reshaping it into something that could no longer sustain the balance it once had? It was a question without a clear answer, a dilemma without an easy resolution, and as the forces within Helios continued to shift, as alliances strained and perceptions hardened, it became increasingly clear that the true impact of Infinity's arrival would not be measured solely in victories or defeats, but in what remained of the balance once the dust had settled, and whether anything resembling it could ever be restored again. There are wars that erupt from ambition, others from fear, and some from the slow, inevitable collision of forces that were never meant to coexist within the same fragile space. And in the Helios Cluster, the conflict that now ignited was born not from a single spark, but from a convergence of tensions that had been building since the moment the UNSC Infinity emerged into a galaxy already on the edge of transformation, a war that no longer resembled the scattered skirmishes and calculated engagements of the past, but had evolved into something far more decisive, far more consuming, a full-scale confrontation that would determine not just who held power in Helios, but what kind of future the cluster would be allowed to have. The Kett Empire, adaptive and relentless, had reached a threshold in their understanding of this new adversary, their previous attempts at measured escalation replaced by a doctrine of total commitment, because they had come to recognize that Infinity was not merely another obstacle to be absorbed or circumvented, but a fundamental disruption to the process of exaltation itself, a force that threatened to deny them access not only to territory, but to the biological and technological evolution that defined their existence, and in that realization, their strategy shifted from expansion to annihilation, from opportunistic conquest to existential war. Across the cluster, the signs of this escalation became impossible to ignore as Kett fleets began to mobilize in numbers and formations that far exceeded anything previously encountered, their movements coordinated with a precision that suggested a singular, unified objective, their targets no longer limited to isolated outposts or vulnerable systems, but expanding to include strategic locations that, if seized, would fracture the Initiative's growing network and isolate Infinity from the very forces it sought to protect. For the Initiative, the scale of this mobilization forced a reckoning that had been long deferred, a recognition that survival could no longer be maintained through cautious expansion and reactive defense, that the presence of Infinity had changed the stakes so profoundly that neutrality was no longer an option, and that the war unfolding around them would demand not just their participation, but their full commitment, their transformation from settlers into a unified force willing to fight for a future that was no longer guaranteed. Aboard Infinity, the response was immediate and decisive, but not without internal conflict, because the moment that many within its command had anticipated and others had feared, had finally arrived, the point at which their role in Helios would be defined not by isolated interventions, but by sustained warfare on a scale that would test not only their capabilities, but their purpose, forcing them to confront the question that had lingered since their arrival, whether they were here to defend, to dominate, or to become something in between. The decision, once made, was executed with the precision and coordination that had come to define the vessel, as Infinity began to marshal not just its own formidable assets, but the combined forces of the Initiative and its allies, transforming a collection of disparate factions into a coalition bound not by convenience, but by necessity, a unified front facing an enemy that no longer sought to negotiate, adapt, or coexist, but to consume and reshape everything in its path. The battlefield that would come to define this war was not a single location, but a network of critical systems whose control would determine the flow of resources, the movement of fleets, and the ability of either side to sustain their efforts over time, a strategic lattice upon which the future of Helios would be decided, and at its center lay a nexus of immense importance. A convergence point where Kett forces had established a fortified stronghold designed not only to project power, but to draw Infinity into a confrontation on terms of their choosing. It was a trap. And it was also an opportunity. Because while the Kett sought to leverage their numbers and their adaptability, to overwhelm Infinity through sheer scale and coordinated assault, Infinity's command recognized that the very concentration of enemy forces presented a chance to deliver a decisive blow, to cripple the Kett's operational capacity in a single, overwhelming engagement, if they were willing to commit fully to the battle that lay ahead. The coalition assembled with a sense of urgency that bordered on inevitability, as ships from across the Initiative, Angron fleets hardened by years of resistance, and the unmatched presence of Infinity itself converged on the contested region, their arrival marking the transition from scattered conflict to total war, their formation a declaration that the future of Helios would not be decided through attrition alone, but through confrontation on a scale that would leave no room for ambiguity. The opening moments of the battle were defined by chaos, as Kett forces initiated their assault with a ferocity that reflected both their desperation and their determination, their fleets surging forward in layered formations designed to overwhelm defenses, their weapons saturating space with destructive force, their strategy focused not on finesse, but on pressure, an unrelenting barrage intended to fracture the coalition before it could fully coordinate its response. Infinity met that assault head-on. Its presence on the battlefield was both a shield and a spear, absorbing the initial wave of attacks with its advanced defenses while simultaneously deploying countermeasures and strike forces that began to carve through the Kett formations with calculated precision, its actions setting the tone for the engagement, establishing a rhythm of resistance and retaliation that the rest of the coalition could align with. Around it, the battle expanded in every direction as Initiative vessels, though less advanced, leveraged their numbers and coordination to engage Kett ships in tightly controlled formations, their movements guided by data and strategies relayed from Infinity's command systems, while Angron forces brought their own expertise to bear, executing maneuvers that exploited weaknesses in Kett tactics, their familiarity with the enemy allowing them to anticipate and counter patterns that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. But the Kett were not static. They adapted. As the battle unfolded, their formations began to shift, their tactics evolving in real time as they responded to the coalition's strategies, their focus narrowing on Infinity itself, recognizing that as long as it remained operational, the coalition would retain its cohesion, its confidence, its ability to resist the overwhelming pressure being applied. They concentrated their fire. Wave after wave of Kett vessels began to converge on Infinity, their attacks coordinated with a level of precision that suggested a singular directive, to bring down the central pillar of the coalition, to shatter the force around which the entire resistance had formed, and in doing so, to collapse the fragile unity that had been built in response to their threat. The strain on Infinity's systems became evident, as its defenses absorbed an unprecedented level of sustained assault, its energy reserves taxed, its systems pushed to their limits. But even under that pressure, it continued to operate with a level of efficiency that bordered on the extraordinary, redirecting power, reinforcing shields, and coordinating counterattacks that prevented the Kett from achieving the breakthrough they sought. The turning point came not from a single action, but from a convergence of efforts, as the coalition, recognizing the focus of the Kett assault, adjusted its strategy to relieve the pressure on Infinity, Initiative and Angron forces intensifying their attacks on the flanks of the Kett formations, disrupting their coordination, forcing them to divert resources, to adapt not just to Infinity, but to the entire coalition acting in unison. It was in that moment that the true potential of the alliance revealed itself. Not as a collection of forces orbiting a central power, but as a network of capabilities working in concert, each contributing in ways that amplified the others, creating a synergy that the Kett, for all their adaptability, struggled to counter. Infinity, no longer the sole focus of the battle, shifted from defense to offense. Its weapons, held in reserve for precisely this moment, were brought to bear with devastating effect, targeting key Kett command vessels, disrupting their coordination, fracturing their formations in ways that could not be immediately recovered from, its actions transforming the battlefield from a struggle for survival into an opportunity for decisive victory. The Kett, facing a breakdown in their command structure, began to falter, their once coordinated assault devolving into fragmented engagements, their adaptability hindered by the loss of centralized control, their forces still dangerous, still formidable, but no longer unified in purpose or execution. The coalition pressed the advantage. What had begun as a defensive struggle evolved into a relentless advance, as Infinity and its allies pushed deeper into the Kett stronghold, dismantling defenses, neutralizing remaining forces, and ultimately collapsing the strategic nexus that had anchored the Kett's presence in the region. The battle ended not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual realization that the Kett, for the first time, had been forced into retreat on a scale that could not be dismissed as temporary, their forces withdrawing, their presence diminished, their plans disrupted in ways that would take time to recover from. It was a victory. Undeniable. Hard-fought. Transformative. But like all victories of such magnitude, it came with consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Because in securing the future of Helios, the coalition had also redefined it. Infinity had proven not just that it could defend the cluster, but that it could lead it, coordinate it, and, when necessary, dominate the very structure of conflict within it, and in doing so, it had solidified its position as the central force around which all others now revolved. For some, that was a source of hope, a sign that stability could finally be achieved, that the chaos and uncertainty that had defined the cluster could be replaced with order and security. For others, it was a warning. Because the same power that had secured victory could just as easily reshape the future in ways that were not universally agreed upon, ways that might prioritize efficiency over autonomy, stability over freedom. The war for the future had been fought. And won. But the future itself remained uncertain, not because of the enemies that had been defeated, but because of the power that had emerged victorious. And what it would choose to become. There are endings that feel like conclusions, where the echoes of war fade into silence and the future unfolds along a path that seems, if not certain, then at least stable. And then there are endings like this one, where victory does not resolve the questions that gave rise to conflict, but instead magnifies them, stretching them across the stars until they become impossible to ignore. And in the aftermath of the war that reshaped the Helios Cluster, the UNSC Infinity stood not as a symbol of closure, but as the axis upon which an entirely new era now began to turn. The Kett had been pushed back, their dominance fractured, their expansion halted in ways that would take generations to fully recover from, and yet they had not been erased, not entirely, because forces like the Kett do not simply vanish, they adapt, they retreat, they evolve in the shadows, and the knowledge of that persistence lingered in every system that had witnessed the war. A quiet reminder that the victory achieved was not absolute, but conditional, dependent on what came next. For the Initiative, the transformation was undeniable, because the fragile experiment that had once defined its existence had now been thrust into a position of influence that it had never been designed to hold, its outposts no longer isolated points of survival, but interconnected centers of activity supported by a network of security and infrastructure that owed as much to Infinity's presence as it did to their own efforts. And in that transformation, the Initiative faced a question that cut to the core of its identity, whether it would remain a coalition of explorers and settlers, or evolve into something more structured, more authoritative, shaped by the realities of a galaxy that no longer allowed for passive existence. Among the Angara, the aftermath carried a weight that was both familiar and new, because while they had fought and endured through conflict before, this war had introduced a variable that could not be easily categorized, a power that had fought alongside them, protected them, and yet now stood in a position that no ally had ever occupied, one that carried with it the potential for both stability and imbalance, for cooperation and control, and in that uncertainty, their leaders found themselves navigating a path that required not just diplomacy, but vigilance, a careful balance between trust and caution that reflected the lessons of their past. Aboard Infinity itself, the atmosphere was one of reflection tempered by unease, because for all the success that had been achieved, for all the lives that had been saved and the threats that had been neutralized, there remained a recognition that the vessel and its crew had crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return, that their actions had not just influenced the outcome of a war, but had redefined the structure of an entire region of space, placing them in a role that extended far beyond their original mission parameters. The debates that had once been theoretical, confined to discussions and projections, now carried an immediacy that could not be ignored, because the question of what Infinity should be in this new reality was no longer abstract, it was urgent, its answer shaping not just their own future, but the future of every faction that now looked to them, whether with hope, fear, or a combination of both. There were those who believed that the path forward was clear, that Infinity should embrace the role it had already begun to assume, acting as a guardian of the cluster, a stabilizing force that could prevent the resurgence of threats like the Kett while supporting the continued growth and cooperation of the Initiative and its allies, a vision rooted in protection, in stewardship, in the belief that power, when guided by principle, could serve as a foundation for lasting peace. But even within that perspective, there were complexities that could not be easily resolved, because guardianship, by its very nature, implies authority, implies the ability to act decisively in the face of danger, and the line between protection and control is often defined not by intention, but by perception, by how those actions are viewed by those who are subject to them. Others, more pragmatic or perhaps more cautious, argued for a different approach, one that emphasized independence, that sought to limit Infinity's direct involvement in the internal affairs of the cluster, focusing instead on maintaining its own integrity, its own mission, and allowing the Initiative and the Angara to shape their own destinies without the overshadowing presence of a force that could, intentionally or not, dictate outcomes through sheer capability. Yet even that approach carried its own risks, because withdrawal in a galaxy still recovering from war could create vacuums that would inevitably be filled by forces less inclined toward cooperation, less constrained by principles, and the knowledge of what the Kett had been capable of ensured that the idea of stepping back entirely was as unsettling as the prospect of stepping forward too forcefully. And then there was a third possibility, one that had not been part of their original considerations, but had emerged through the unique convergence of circumstances that defined their situation. The idea that Infinity could become something entirely new, not simply a guardian or an observer, but a bridge, a catalyst for a new kind of structure within Helios, one that did not centralize power in a single entity, but distributed it through cooperation, shared responsibility, and mutual accountability. It was an idealistic vision, and perhaps the most difficult to achieve, because it required not just restraint, but trust, not just strength, but humility, a willingness to guide without dominating, to support without controlling, to exist as a force that enabled others rather than overshadowed them. The challenge lay not in the concept itself, but in its execution, because the reality of power is that it shapes expectations, it influences decisions, it creates dependencies, and even with the best intentions, the presence of Infinity would continue to alter the dynamics of the cluster in ways that could not be entirely mitigated. Beyond the internal deliberations, the wider galaxy had already begun to respond, as factions adjusted their strategies, their alliances, and their perceptions based on the new reality that had emerged, some seeking closer ties with the Initiative and Infinity, viewing them as a source of stability and opportunity, others maintaining distance, wary of becoming too closely aligned with a power whose long-term intentions were still being defined. The exiles, ever adaptable, found themselves in a position that required recalibration, their previous strategies of exploitation and disruption now complicated by the presence of a force that could not be easily manipulated or avoided, forcing them to consider new approaches, new alliances, new ways of navigating a landscape that had shifted beneath them. And in the shadows, the remnants of the Kett endured. Their losses had been significant, their expansion halted, their structures disrupted, but their nature remained unchanged, their drive to adapt, to evolve, to reclaim what had been denied to them persisting even in defeat, a quiet but ever-present reminder that the conflict that had just concluded was not the end of their story, but a chapter within it. All of these threads, these perspectives, these uncertainties, converged around a single, inescapable reality that the Heleus Cluster was no longer what it had been, that the balance that once defined it had been irrevocably altered, and that at the center of that transformation stood the UNSC Infinity, a vessel that had become far more than the sum of its technology and its crew, a symbol of possibility and of risk, of protection and of power. The decision of what it would become could not be delayed indefinitely, because inaction, in a system already shaped by its presence, was itself a choice, one that would allow existing dynamics to solidify, to evolve without guidance, to potentially drift toward outcomes that might be more difficult to influence later. In the end, the path that Infinity would take would not be defined by a single declaration, but by a series of actions, choices made in moments of uncertainty, responses to challenges that had yet to fully emerge, a gradual shaping of its role through engagement and restraint, through cooperation and independence. It would be defined by how it responded to the next crisis, and the one after that, by whether it chose to act when it could, or to hold back when it should, by whether it listened as much as it led. The galaxy would watch. The Initiative would adapt. The Angara would remember. And somewhere beyond the edges of what had already been fought and won, new challenges would begin to take shape, drawn not just by the opportunities of a recovering cluster, but by the presence of a power that had proven itself capable of changing the course of history. The UNSC Infinity had entered the Andromeda Galaxy as an anomaly, an unexpected arrival in an already complex system. It now stood as something far greater, a new power, not defined solely by what it had done, but by what it would choose to become. And in that choice lay the true future of Helios, a future that would be shaped not just by strength, but by the wisdom to understand how that strength should be used, and by the restraint to ensure that in saving a galaxy, it did not become something that galaxy would one day need to be saved from. In the end, the arrival of the UNSC Infinity in the Andromeda Galaxy was never just a moment of displacement or survival, but the beginning of a transformation so profound that it reshaped the very identity of the Heleus Cluster, turning what was once a fragile experiment in exploration into a crucible where power, purpose, and morality were tested against forces that refused to yield or coexist, and through that trial, something entirely new emerged, something that could not be easily categorized as hero or conqueror, savior, or destabilizer, but existed in the complex space between them. The war against the Kett had proven that Infinity was more than capable of altering the balance of power, of standing against an empire built on forced evolution and bending its advance into retreat. Yet that same victory revealed a deeper truth, that power on such a scale does not simply resolve conflict, it redefines it, creating new dynamics, new dependencies, and new fears that ripple outward long after the last battle has ended, embedding themselves into the decisions and perceptions of every faction that remains. For the Initiative, Infinity became both shield and shadow, a force that ensured their survival while simultaneously challenging their independence, forcing them to confront whether their future would be one of self-determination or quiet reliance on a protector whose presence could not help but influence every outcome, no matter how carefully it chose to act. For the Angara, the alliance forged in war carried the weight of cautious hope, tempered by the memory of what it meant to live under the control of a dominant power, leaving them to navigate a path where trust had to be earned continuously, not assumed, and where vigilance remained as necessary as cooperation. Even in the silence that followed the great battles, the echoes of conflict persisted in subtler forms, in the recalibration of alliances, in the quiet movements of those who sought to exploit or resist the new order, and in the enduring presence of the Kett themselves, diminished but not destroyed, their capacity for adaptation ensuring that they would remain a factor in the unfolding future, a reminder that no victory is ever truly final in a galaxy defined by change. At the center of it all stood Infinity, no longer simply a warship or a symbol of humanity's reach, but a defining force in a region of space that now revolved, in part, around its existence, and the question that lingered was no longer whether it could shape the future, but how it would choose to do so, whether it would lean into the role of guardian, maintaining balance through strength and restraint, or drift toward something more controlling, more directive, shaping the destiny of others in ways that might one day mirror the very threats it had fought to overcome. This is the paradox that defines the story, that the same force capable of saving a galaxy can also, if unchecked, reshape it in ways that blur the line between protection and dominance. And it is within that tension that the true narrative continues, not as a closed chapter, but as an evolving journey where every decision carries weight, where every action contributes to a legacy that is still being written. Because the arrival of Infinity did not just change the outcome of a war. It changed the trajectory of an entire galaxy. And in that change lies the ultimate question, one that extends beyond battles and alliances, beyond victories and losses, into the very nature of power itself, asking not what can be done, but what should be done, and whether those who hold that power can wield it in a way that preserves not just order, but freedom. The Heleus Cluster endures, scarred yet strengthened, uncertain yet alive with possibility, its future no longer bound by the limitations that once defined it, but open to paths that have yet to be explored, shaped by forces that are still learning what they are meant to be. And somewhere among the stars, at the intersection of intention and consequence, the UNSC Infinity continues its journey, not as a final answer, but as a question in motion, a presence that will define the next chapter not by its power alone, but by the choices that guide it. Because in the end, the greatest impact it can have is not in the wars it wins, but in the future it chooses to build.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic, what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if